Welcome into the Inside Bassmaster Podcast. I'm your host today, Ronnie Moore. My co-host, as always, is Kyle Jessie. And Kyle, we've got a special episode we do once per month. It's called the Pattern of the Month segment. We bring an Elite Series Pro on to discuss what the fish are doing in a specific region of the world, maybe all of the country, but in a specific region during this month. And if you guys are enjoying this, on Instagram, on YouTube, on Instagram, on the podcast platforms, just leave a like, leave a review, and comment what you'd like to hear us talk about and who you'd like to have on the podcast. Today's guest for the pattern of the month of June is none other than Matt Arey. And Matt, that's probably a good compliment because that means you have some great finishes in the month of June if we're going to have you on for the pattern of the month segment.
Yeah, you're the stat king, and when you texted me that earlier and you were reminding me of the tournaments, and I didn't even realize all those were actually June tournaments. And the reason is, and we'll talk about that in a minute, is because a lot of them fished drastically different from the others. So I didn't even realize it, but you reminded me that those were all actual June events.
Kyle, we just wrapped up Pickwick, which was obviously the first week of June, the first few days of June, and Matt finished in the top 15. I think it was 13th place. And so a great overall event for him. So I'm excited to have you on the podcast with me as usual and also have Matt with us.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're going to get into some really interesting topics here. A lot of times you think of June and you think of deep fishing, but I think we're going to get into a little bit of both deep and shallow because Matt's obviously had some success in Elite Series tournaments here in the last few years where he's able to, combine two of which where he's, fish shallow and deep. So it'll be interesting to get Matt's take on some of these things.
Yeah. So for Matt, the couple tournaments that I texted you about was 2019 at Lake Guntersville. That was a different Lake Guntersville than we've seen, right now in the present day because of all the grass changes. And then 2020 Eufaula, we had that long break with the COVID delay, and Eufaula was pushed to June. That was our first event there back after that. And you had a little bit of both there going on. And then we had 2021 came around for the Classic. That was pushed to June, and you did well on topwater there. And then this year, last week, Pickwick, you obviously did well offshore. So first off, for the viewers, set up what you think when you think of June fishing in the South for places that are, predominantly largemouth. If you want to stray off to the other species or another part of the country, just what do you think about when you think June fishing in the South?
Well, the most obvious thing that comes to mind is offshore fishing, ledge fishing. Obviously, if you're a Tennessee River rat and you're talking about some of the TVA lakes, ledge fishing is a big deal. Even on some of the lakes like Eufaula, but Eufaula is more of a brush pile related deal. But I think offshore fishing, ledge fishing, brush pile fishing, that comes to mind first. But, I think what's overlooked a lot, especially by a lot of weekend anglers is the how good a shallow bite, especially in early June, can be due to a lot of different reasons, whether it's mayflies or bluegill beds or whatever. But some of the biggest fish in the lake actually live shallow through the month of June, through the whole summer. They're kind of more nomadic and more isolated, in my opinion, but there's some true giants that actually cruise the shallows all summer.
That kind of makes me think real quick about the situation we're dealing with shad, gizzard shad, bluegill. You're coming off in April and May, you're coming off the spawn in most places. The shad spawn has happened and it's either just finished up or it's been a week or so. And a lot of those people will classify it as the post-spawn funk, those 2 weeks where they just don't bite well. But I feel like it's the best month or the best tournaments to junk fish around because you do have the opportunity of maybe a shad spawn. It might be fading, but it might be present, keep some fish shallow. You have the bluegill bed opportunity as well for those people fishing shallow. But then for those people fishing offshore, you might see some of the biggest schools that you'll ever see all year that first week or two of June.
Yeah, and a lot of those schools are not used to. They weren't quite as beat up. Now with the advancement in electronics and technology, the second they get out there, they start getting pounded on. But you're right. I mean, this is the first week of June. I always say Memorial Day in Canterbury. My roommate on the road always talks about Memorial Day is usually the magical time of year for the TVA system, for those true mega schools to start reaching the main channel out there and getting set up to where you can catch them and have some of the best days of fishing all year.
So Matt, obviously we talked a decent bit about, Tennessee River lakes, obviously just getting off of Pickwick. Let's talk about the lakes that are not river system lakes. Obviously, a lot of the lakes in North Carolina that you fish, The lakes I grew up fishing in Arkansas that Ronnie's getting to fish now, there's not really main river ledges. That's not really even a thing. And the fish a lot of times don't even necessarily school up. You can still find them offshore, but you don't find the big groups. Talk about some of the types of places you look in those types of lakes, for offshore fish. You kind of mentioned brush piles, but what are some of the other things you look for?
Well, you hit the nail on the head with the main thing that I look for, and that's offshore brush. I think the biggest difference in your Tennessee River system stuff and like the lakes that we grew up fishing is the difference in current. So that doesn't allow those fish to really set up on those places like it does in the Tennessee River system. When you find a big school of water, you can find wads of fish and big schools of fish on lakes like Lake Norman and places like that. We might be talking more spotted bass related stuff then, but the problem with that is and you touched on it, they're there one day and gone the next. And when you don't have a lot of current in a place, yeah, they slide into a brush pile and set up, but they may not be there 2 hours later. They may move out in the deep water, suspend, feed, chase shad, herring, whatever it may be. They're not super reliable, and they move a lot more. The current related fish to me are a lot more reliable, and they stay in those areas even if they're not set up to really feed based on the current. They're still in those general areas. Sometimes they'll slide off deep and suspend, but they'll still stay relatively close to where they like to set up for the summer. Our lakes, they just roam around all the time, but brush piles would be the number one factor. The ends of long tapering points that actually, dip off into the main river channel. Big major point, bridges are a big deal. Anytime you have neck down areas, when you have a lack of current, those little neck down areas at least can give you areas that have a maximum current flow for that particular system. Even though it's not, comparable to a Tennessee River system, it's still an area to where you can capitalize on feeding fish in a smaller area. And, your margin for error is a lot smaller on those bridges and those things like that, the corners and things like that. So, bridges are a big player. Brush piles are a big player. Long extended points that dip off into the main river channel are a big player. Even channel swing banks that are overlooked a little bit, this time of year. I think that's more of a pre-spawn wintertime type deal, but I have caught some really nice fish on channel swing banks back in creeks and things like that during this time of year too.
So for people who may not know, looking at their graph, looking at their electronics, they maybe have different mapping than you do. When you're looking at contour lines for a long point, explain to the viewers what that might look like or how we know, obviously tight contours means, sudden drops or access to deep water, but a long tapering point looks a little different than that for some people, especially because it's probably a lot flatter. Some of them are spread out more, and then all of a sudden it happens.
Well, and you hit it. It's more consistent for a longer extended distance. On your graph, you'll see that on your mapping. On any mapping, the contour lines are going to be very similar for a long tapering point. I like a long tapering point that does reach out to the channel, whether it's a creek channel or a main river channel or main lake channel, whatever whatever you're fishing. But I look at a tapering point just like I do a channel swing bank or a dock or whatever. I want something to separate it from everything else. So look for differences in that, meaning, there might be really tight contour lines on one corner of it where it actually dips off in the channel, but then it flattens out and it even extends past that. So look for little sweet spots and transitions to where it's not just a flat tapering point that slowly tapers all the way into the channel. Look for little differences and little changes in those contours for those long points to typically makes them a little bit better. And it'll give you a few more options, when you're fishing those points and kind of some sweet spots, so to speak.
And those points can be different depths. When you're talking, any lake, you can go to long tapering points on Lake Norman and find 7 different variable depths that they're in. But are you going to be, when you maybe get behind your console, what depth zone are you looking for? Maybe 80 degree, 85 degree water, somewhere in that range for a long tapering point. Are you looking 15 to 25, or is it 12 to 17? Where are you going to put your trolling motor in the water to try to make your first cast on a point?
Well, if I had to really narrow
generalize it, yeah.
That's a loaded question.
It is. Yes.
But if we're talking about Lake Norman, I have caught them as deep as 40 foot there. But if we're just going to narrow it down, my boat's sitting anywhere from 25 to 30, typically throwing up into 18 to 22 seems to be a pretty good starting point. And then I'll slide off. Obviously, our electronics are so good, I'll be able to grab the fish and kind of figure out where they're set up. But that 18 to 22, 23 foot range is a pretty consistent range just for getting bit. But I have seen really big schools of fish, especially on Norman, get out there in 30, 35 feet of water this time of year.
Now, on the brink of map study, obviously, I think that's a huge part of fishing offshore. If you just go to a lake without any preparation and just start looking, it's easy to get bored, lose interest. I mean, it gets pretty tough. So talk about your pre-tournament preparation, map study, whatever you want to call it, when you go to a place that you're not as familiar with in this time of year, knowing that you're probably going to fish offshore.
Knowing I'm going to fish offshore, I'm going to try to get a good idea on what section of the lake. Now, of course, I have roommates that we kind of help break the lake down a little bit quicker. If none of us have ever been there, we get on the body of water and, one of us goes this way, one of us goes the other way. That helps, a great deal. But one thing that I do is I look at sections of the lake that typically have more to offer, as opposed to not just, way up the river in this creek arm or whatever. There's 2 long tapering points, just for instance, that's what we're looking for. But on the lower end of the lake, the lower third of the lake has 17 to 20 of them. So I'm gonna start my search in those areas that have a lot more to offer, a lot more transitions, like we were talking about earlier, and just a lot more places that the fish can actually set up. And it may not be just tapering points, maybe little underwater humps, underwater islands. It may be ledges. It may be little turns in the creek channel. I want to look at the mouths of major creeks. Number one, that's an obvious migration route for a lot of the fish that are coming out of these creeks this time of year. And then I want to look at some main river stuff or main channel stuff that's typically in the lower third of the lake. Lower third of the lake, to me, normally has a little bit more to offer. It's typically where the lake opens up a little bit more. You can move around a little bit more, and there's a lot more options and bigger creeks that dump in those areas.
Well, you kind of saw that at Lake Hartwell. The guy who was fishing the deepest in the Classic was the guy who was at the bottom third of the lake, Justin Hamner, fishing way off, off the points and off the shoals for that. That's different deal with spotted bass and blueback herring. But you mentioned it to kick off the show. I said, what do you think of when you think of June? You said offshore fishing. So when you get into a tournament mindset, knowing you're probably going to offshore fish, like you probably did at 2019 at Lake Gunnersville, heavy grass, and then Pickwick this week, you're like, I'm probably going to be fishing offshore. Your second thought is, I really don't want to share any water with anybody this week. I think every single person on Bassmaster Live is like, yeah, I really don't like fishing in crowds. Well, when 94 people say I don't like fishing in crowds, but you're going to have to do that. Everyone would love to share spots with 0 people, but going into those tournaments, how do you balance that mindset wise? Because I don't know if you shared water with anyone at Pickwick this week, but I remember you shared water at Gunnersville with Brandon Lester. I think even a David Fritz, and then obviously Canterbury was around there as well. And that was on a road bed, not a ledge. But for you guys, mentally sharing water with people, managing your schools of fish as well, how do you approach that?
Well, in a perfect world, obviously, like you said, we never want to share any of our fish, right? This is an individual sport and we're all out there trying to win a tournament. But, I at this point in my career, and I've been doing it 13, 14 years, I've seen a lot of just, I hate, ignorance on the water. Ethics is something that doesn't get addressed enough in our sport. And what I do, how I approach it, if somebody's on a school of fish, and I know it's not a one cast deal, I'm not going to pull in there and if somebody's sitting on a really, really juicy little tiny shell bed that they got to make one
pile,
or a brush pile. Yeah, absolutely. But if they're on a megawatt of fish, I'll slide up in there. I'll pull in behind them. I'm not going to fish in front of them or the same direction they are. And I'll just talk to them. I'll say, hey, is it okay that I fish this school with you? And 9 times out of 10 at our level, at least, most of the guys are pretty good. Most of them, not all of them. But
that's another podcast time. That's another topic.
Well, yeah. And like I said, that opens up a whole new can of worms. But, this is my thought, Ronnie. If I pull in and somebody's sitting there, I'll say, hey, Scott Canterbury, just for the sake of the conversation here, Scott, is it okay if I fish with you? He'll say, well, I'd rather you not, and if he said that, I'll say, all right, so when I come here tomorrow, just don't pull in on me. That's the way it's going to be. So do you want to fish it by yourself today, or do you want me to fish it by myself tomorrow, or do you want to work together? So they have the option, and that's where I'll leave it. And if they want to play nice, we'll play nice. If they don't, then we won't. But I'm not gonna sit here and get mad about it. I'm too old for that crap, and I've been in this game long enough to know that if you fish stressed, you're going to get your teeth kicked in at this level. So just keep an open mind and just don't stress over it.
Moving on to a topic that's not quite as controversial. Obviously, we talked about it early on in the podcast, fishing shallow and deep, a mixture of the two. One of the tournaments Ronnie and I have talked about on multiple occasions, just, talking about fishing, is the Eufaula tournament, where you're able to fish deep, fish brush piles, and then slide up on the bank and fish, a frog and flip, and be able to do both in the same tournament. Talk about that a little bit, because there's things that'll keep the fish obviously up on the bank or in shallow water. When you get to a situation or a body of water like that, what are some of the things you try to keep in mind?
Well, that to me, that's a perfect scenario in the way I like to fish. I don't necessarily like to dedicate my whole tournament offshore. I don't like to dedicate my whole tournament shallow unless it's the spring of the year. If I can do both, I'm kind of in my zone. I don't feel like I'm a fisherman that has a lot of an individual strength, but I like to do a little bit of everything. I like to do whatever it takes to catch fish. But when I can bounce back and forth, I'm a little bit more comfortable. But I think the couple factors that really make me believe that there's a really strong shallow bite along with a deep bite, which is about everywhere this time of year to an extent, is forage availability and water level. Watch those moon phases. That brings a lot of the brim up and things like that. That's their number one food source this time of year when you're talking about really shallow fish in June, especially in the South. And water level. Water level was the biggest thing that Eufaula. If y'all remember, the water was relatively high, above normal. A lot of that willow grass had really, really good water on it. I think a couple guys caught them flipping some, maybe even some pennyworts and reeds and things like that up the river. I didn't mess with any of that stuff. I was fishing shallow down the lake.
What's really good water? What's really good water, before we move on and forget that? When you see water willow and it's getting towards the summertime, what's really good water? Is that 1 to 2 feet of water? Is it 3 to 5?
Don't get me wrong, you can catch a fish in 6 inches of willowy grass in the water, but if you've got 2 foot on the end of that grass and some of that grass is just barely submerged, to me, that's perfect grass. Like that's plenty of water to hold not just a random fish here and there, but actually hold groups of fish and multiple bites. And it holds more life. When you get that much grass and that much water on it, just holds more life in general. So there's a lot more room for the bluegill and things to run around in. And that's what those fish that Eufaula were keying in on. There were brim beds too that were very active. And a lot of my shallow fish came on a half-ounce custom bluegill colored jig and a popping frog. So those fish were keyed in on those bluegill, and that's what I was able to capitalize on there in that particular situation. But water level had everything to do with that bite.
Well, I know that you were one of the leaders and co-leaders of that event early in the event. I think maybe it was day 2 or day 3. You were right at the top. I think there was a turn in that Eufaula event where there was 7 or 8 guys in the top 10 shallow. And I looked at Mark Zona on live and I said, I was right. I said shallow was going to work out and win. And a lot of those guys ended up falling out of the top 12 and didn't make the final day, didn't make the top 10, whatever the case may be. But you were able to survive because you did balance that offshore deal. How comfortable did it make you that week, knowing that, man, if I don't get 1 or 2 bites up shallow early in the morning, my day is not done, or not, I'm not worried. I don't have to scramble. I can just slide out and fish some brush piles. And also, choosing brush piles can be difficult. You might have to make a bunch of stops before you do so.
Yeah, there again with technology now, you can actually see the fish in those brush piles, so you kind of know if you're wasting your time on one or if there's actually a target that you're trying to hit in that brush pile, meaning a bass. And the guys that fished exclusively shallow, I do think they were going to run into some trouble because yes, there was quite a few shallow fish, but you're talking about the best fishermen in the world, and they just smoked them the first couple of days, and there was only so many to go around. So having that in my back pocket and having a bunch of brush piles to run, I felt really, really good going into that tournament. And I felt like the potential was there to win doing that because I didn't think the shallow fish were going to dominate for 4 days in a row. I didn't think a guy could do that every day, all day, not with the brush pile bite and the offshore bite that was starting to happen. To me, that's a perfect scenario for a guy going into a June tournament to have a strong shallow bite and a strong offshore bite going. But yeah, it was not a stressful tournament for the simple fact that you just said. I had a lot of options, and there was a shallow bite all through the day. It was just a matter of timing, I think, more or less. But the brush pile bite was the same way. I bounced around those brush piles. They did seem to get a little bit better as the day went on. So I didn't spend a lot of time running brush early, which was it made my day a little bit more efficient too.
So let me ask you this too. So let's say for somebody that's maybe not familiar with fishing brush piles, if I remember correctly, in that Eufaula event, you were fishing even some brush piles on the ends of docks and things of that nature. For somebody that's really never fished brush piles, where do people drop them? Where do you find that you find the most? Like if you were going to go drop brush piles, because I mean, that's really how you have to think about that. If you go to a lake where you're not familiar with it, where are people going to be dropping these brush piles? Where are some of the places that you find to be most highly, I guess where most of the brush piles live?
Dock lakes or non-dock lakes, because that's a difference as well.
Yeah, let's start at dock lakes to make it obvious. I will look at some of the older residential areas on the lake, especially some of the older docks and things like that. You can see it on Google Earth. These big, giant, brand new, multi-million-dollar houses. Typically, those people aren't big, crappy fishermen.
Indoor bass fishing on Zillow as well. The house rates and.
Oh yeah, that's right. There you go. A lot of different ways to research that, but just turning that side imaging on and trolling in front of as many docks as you can. That's the easiest, most simple way. On a dock lake, as far as a non-dock lake, those points that we were talking about, those are some obvious places that will always have brush piles, channel swings, little swings on islands. Guys love to sink brush around islands. They do that at Hartwell, they do it at Norman, they do it at all over these herring lakes where there's little isolated islands. There seem to always be brush piles around islands. Islands have a lot of transitions. They typically have a flat point over here, a swing in them, all kinds of different transitions. So, that's a good place to look too. But points, secondary points, creek channel swings, kind of some of the things we were talking about fishing earlier. A lot of those places under offshore humps, offshore humps, you go to Lanier and every offshore hump on the lake has 3 brush piles on it. So, those are some of the places that I start my search.
So if you had to pick 3 baits and you can change them for ledge fishing or just offshore fishing in general, and I know that guys always have 10 to 20 rods on their deck in June, it seems, but if you had to just rig up 3 and lean on those baits, what would be your 3 offshore baits this time of the year? Whether it was Pickwick this past week or just in general, maybe targeting brush, maybe targeting rock.
Yeah, I'm gonna go with a deep crankbait. If I'm targeting brush, I like a crankbait that I know is just gonna tick the top of that brush. Caught a ton of fish doing that over the years, just cranking brush. And I like a pulse jig. I like a pulse jig for that's something that's overlooked a lot, but that catches, especially in spotted bass lakes right now. And when they're suspended over brush or whatever, that pulse jig will catch a ton of fish.
What's a pulse jig for fans who might not know what a pulse jig is? It's not like a jig with a skirt.
No, you can go to Pulse Fish Lures and check them out, but a pulse jig is a little head. It's got a lip on it, similar to a scrounger type bait. And I'll put a little bitty minnow imitation on the back of it, whether it's 3 or 4 inches, just trying to match the hatch, whatever it is on that particular body of water. And you just chunk it, count it down, and wind it in. And we got a lot of different sizes, so you just buy the size based on the depth that you're fishing. But it's kind of idiot proof. Like I said, you throw it out, count it down to try to tick the top of that brush and wind it in real slow, and the spots especially will absolutely hammer that thing. The third would have to be I've got 2 baits that kind of cover the upper part of the water column, but I'd want some kind of soft plastic, whether it's a big worm or maybe even a drop shot. I know that's 2 different type deals, but a drop shot for that fickle bite, that'll typically get you a lot of bites this time of year.
And Kyle, I miss the big worm. We only see the big worm for 1 tournament a year, it seems, and we got to see it. We probably saw a little bit of it at Fork, and then we get a little bit more at Pickwick. But man, that old school old monster or mag trick worm or just the 10-inch worms, that's just everyone opts for a big football jig these days, and you just hardly ever see someone throw 3/8 or a quarter ounce on a 10-inch worm.
Yeah, very very rarely it seems, but. If you had to give the same question Ronnie asked you, but for shallow fishing, if you had to pick your top 3 shallow fishing baits for the month of June, what would you go with there?
Frog, jig, and a wacky worm.
I love it. That's what. See, he didn't have to explain it, Kyle, because shallow fishing is better than deep fishing. You pick it up and go.
It's so much more fun to me.
Hey,
I'm just surprised the North Carolina guy not saying a buzzbait in there somewhere mixed in.
No, a frog bite's 10 times better than a buzzbait bite.
So I don't want to rip the scab off, but I feel like I got to talk about it a little bit. The 2021 Classic, you got second place. It was 9,000 degrees on the final day. And that was when you did your best. You came back and made that huge comeback. Obviously, day one, maybe a little bit slower. Day two, you had a good day, I believe, like one of the best days of the week. And then on day three, with the 25 that were out there, your day was another catch-up day, but you were right there, just a fish or two away from winning the Classic. Why people will say that it's opposite of people and what they expect. No clouds, bright sun, hot as the blazes in Texas, yet you caught them on a frog and had a lot more frog bites than people would expect on that final day. For a shallow water angler, the conditions did not set up in your favor probably going into the day. People think that, but why were they in your favor, and how close were you to being able to pull that thing off?
Well, to me, that's an extreme misconception. And 20 years ago, I had the same mindset that, once the sun gets up and the water's 90 degrees, they just not going to hit anything on top. That's 100% not true for shallow fish in summertime. Those fish are up there to feed on one thing, and 9 times out of 10, that's bluegill, some kind of panfish. That particular bite down there, we encountered a situation on Ray Roberts that I don't think is very common for June. The water was extremely high, and it just had a lot of fish pulled up in those bushes, willow trees, and things like that. I did kind of focus on shallow cover that was main lake related, as opposed to really ducking back in some of the creeks and things like that. You could get a random bite back there. It seemed like the larger concentrations of fish were out there on the main channel. And a lot of those fish were some of those remnants of the shad spawn that was going on early in the morning. But I never got on the shad spawn bite. I did notice they would actually eat a white frog a little bit better, which I'm sure that had a lot to do with it. But that I think it was more of a mental game. When it's that hot and the bite's that tough, I just looked for a little bit of something to run with. And I was fortunate enough to just put myself in the right areas with a couple of the right baits. And frog fishing and flipping a jig at that time of year is I've got as much confidence doing that as I do anything. And I think just having confidence in what you're doing, and which I did, it had a lot to do with it. I don't, maybe some of the guys got a random bite here and there, and they just didn't have the confidence to stick with it, or they were just in the wrong area. But after the first couple of days, I was getting enough bites to make it a little bit easier for me to commit to that on the final day.
Now, when you kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier, but when you think about these situations where the fish will stay shallow, obviously, like I said, when it comes to the fall tournament, you mentioned a few of the things that happen there, but just in general, what are some of the things that will keep the fish shallow outside of, like you said, the extreme high water, and obviously the bluegill spawn?
Well, I mean, just forage availability in general. I don't think, another thing is, when you see those turnovers a lot of times, which is, I can't explain it from a science standpoint, but stratification in the water, yada, yada, all that stuff. Anyway, Ronnie, you might can explain that.
That's a big word. That is a big word.
I stole it from Thrift, of all people. You believe that?
That's funny.
But I don't think he knows what it means. He just said it one day, and I think he's just trying to sound.
That means he heard somebody else say it when they explained it.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's why I said it. No, I'm not going to lie.
Yeah, well, the
but
stratification.
Yeah, I think fish will surprise you. I think forage availability, Kyle, is number one. As long as you still got some life shallow, whether it's crawfish or some kind of panfish, whether it's brim, bluegill, whatever, that's a big deal. Not talking about water level like we did earlier. If you get extreme dropping water levels this time of year and things like that, that shallow bite can completely diminish. But I think when you see the turnovers and you see that oxygen depletion in certain zones of the water column, I think you'll see some fish push up super, super, super shallow in the summertime, even times that it'll surprise you. I mean, 91, 92 degree water, sometimes you'll catch them in a foot of water. So, I think the biggest lesson is just always keep an open mind and always, don't write it off before you try it. So always go look shallow this time of year, because like I said, some of the biggest fish in the lake will stay shallow all summer.
Matt, when I think about ledge fishing, especially when the current is always a hot debate, Thursday, Friday, they always run current. Saturday, Sunday, it's probably a lot less. And that's always the days that are the most crucial for anglers. But I like to think about ledge fishing and the current as Florida weather. In the summer, every single day for about 30 to 45 minutes, it will rain. There is no doubt. I don't know if it's 2 to 2:30, if it's 3 to 3:30, it will always rain for at least a little portion of the day in Florida and then go back to normal. there will always be a key bite window late on the Tennessee River. One of the, being a last flight in, or, I left them biting, for you at Pickwick, was there a window in the morning when there was no current for you to be able to catch them? Or was there a window that you leaned on heavily in the afternoon to make your weight?
It was actually a combination of that. I noticed, and I've never been able to put a pattern to it. I've pulled my hair out trying to figure it out, and I just quit trying to figure it out. And if I'm on a big mega school of fish, I'll just stay on them and go through a rotation of baits and try to trigger one to bite here and there throughout the day. But to answer your question, actually, the final day was a perfect example. I got to my starting spot and I actually caught 2 or 3 in the first hour and lost a great big one. And then for 4 hours, I didn't get a bite, Ronnie. I mean, I did not get a bite. I could see them. They were still there. Some of them were still set up just the way you want them. And I still could not get one to bite. And I went through, every bait imaginable. That I know of anyway. And, I actually ducked down shallow for a little bit, went shallow, caught 7 or 8 fish, but nothing that would keep. I did weigh in 1 shallow fish throughout the entire week at Pickwick, which is kind of a fluke, but I bounced around shallow when I saw those mayflies starting to pop up, and I knew John Cox was whacking them, and we all know he wasn't deeper than 2 foot.
Yeah. But no, he didn't even want to be on the TVA at that point. He left the TVA.
Yeah, that's right. He just left the whole system, the heck with it. But the final day, I caught those few real early, and I actually caught 3 we were doing it at 3 o'clock. I was first flight on day 3, and I caught 3 between 2:15 and 2:45 the time I had to leave. And I felt like if I'd have had another hour, I could have caught a couple more. Whether they would have helped me or not was yet to be determined. But there was definitely 2 bite windows on day 3 for me, for the school that I was fishing. Now, there's a lot of variables in those schools of fish, and some of those variables are one of the main ones is current, but another one is the amount of pressure that they've been getting over multiple days, especially multiple tournament days. So I'm like you, there's definitely bite windows, but that seemed to change each day, and that's one of the things that would drive me crazy, honestly.
Yeah, I noticed that where, obviously I think the first 2 days, the bite window in the morning, that first hour, it might have been because y'all graphed all practice and didn't catch any, but it seemed like even with no current and them just kind of, suspending or just getting off the sides, or, they're not on that concentrated cast. It seemed like the bite was good from 8 to 9. The most fish I'd seen all tournament was 8 to 9 each morning. But that was before the current turned on. But we saw some of the biggest fish in the afternoon come. The Cody Huffs of the world, Lester's late fish, some of Zaldane's, they all came in at the end of the day. And I will even say John Cox on day 2, he's about to miss the cut on Bass Track. He was below the cut. He caught 2 great big ones to have one of the biggest bags of the day. He obviously was fishing shallow, but there was an afternoon bite window for that as well. Last thing before we let you go, obviously your Team Toyota partner or teammate, Brandon Lester, got the win at Pickwick. Just well-deserved. What a dominant performance, catching 20 pounds every single day. I said on live he caught a 6-pounder every day, but that was just our guesstimation. I think one of them was 513, one of them was maybe 511, but the other 2 were definitely the biggest fish of the day. You probably got to watch some of the fishing, whether you were driving home or you stayed back on Sunday just to check it out. What were your takeaways about winning a Tennessee River event offshore, but not deep? Maybe that 5 to 15 feet of water, and you weren't out on the main river ledge. You were way, Lester was way up inside the turns and on a different kind of a situation. You guys always watch Bassmaster Live and kind of take notes and reflect on what went wrong. What were your observations watching that final day and the guys that were catching them?
Yeah, and I didn't get to watch a ton of it because I was driving, like you said, but I did watch some, and I watched a few of the highlights. And I did realize, I think the biggest takeaway was Lester. I talked to Lester in practice a little bit, and we talk every once in a while. We're teammates on Team Toyota, and we're pretty good friends. And Brandon's just a really low key, good, very deserving angler, and works really hard, very diverse, very versatile angler. But he had a lot of fallback areas too. I believe, talking to him in practice, I know he had at least 15, 20 schools found. So, but I think the key for him and a takeaway for me was finding something that was a little bit off the beaten path that you could actually catch them multiple ways and you could revisit and know they weren't getting beat up by the entire field. Managing your fish is a big key in ledge tournaments. And when I say managing your fish, I'm talking about more managing the fishermen, because in a ledge tournament now, one of my goals, I never ran more than 5 miles from the ramp the whole tournament. But the reason I did that is because I had 3 or 4 schools located that I could actually visually see while I was fishing another one. To me, that's a big deal. So Lester was able to get away from the crowds and have some stuff to himself, and I think that was definitely the winning factor for him. And that's a big takeaway for me, is trying to find something to yourself, which is really hard to do.
Yeah, and I think, Kyle, you probably saw this out there as well and noticed it, but some of those guys who had an area to themselves on day 1 and 2 caught them and got out of there and got to explore. And then on day 3 and day 4, that's when we really saw Lester actually cull up and utilize those other places he had found, because you got 47 on day 3, so half the anglers are gone. And then on the final day, you lose 37 more anglers. You get to spread out a little bit. But overall, what a fantastic event for him. You were just a bite or so away from making that top 10, Matt. And you are great in the month of June. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the show, 3rd place 2019 at Gunnersville, 7th place 2020 at Eufaula, 2nd at the Classic in 2021 at Ray Roberts, and then 13th this past week in 2022 at Pickwick. That is 4 great finishes for basically the only shot on goal you get in the month of June. So awesome. And we appreciate you taking the time to talk to us about the pattern of the month, the couple baits you like, and kind of your mindset when it comes to fishing.
Hey, it was my pleasure, Ronnie and Kyle, as always. And maybe one day we'll turn one of those into a first place.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe it'll be the $300,000 one if we have to postpone it a little bit again, like into the summertime. But that will work. Kyle, you got anything else?
I do not. We appreciate your time, Matt, and appreciate all the great information.
Yeah, my pleasure, guys. Appreciate you having me.
Awesome. For Ronnie Moore, Kyle, Jessie, and our guy, Matt Arey, appreciate you joining us on the Inside Bassmaster Podcast, the pattern of the month for June. We'll see you at the next Elite event.